In today's video, we're looking at 5 bear attacks so violent and sudden, they stunned even seasoned investigators. From a researcher mauled in the Arctic to a fatal backcountry hike in the Smokies. But first we begin with a case that was quietly buried. But those who read the internal report never forgot it. There were no headlines, no press conferences, just torn tents, spent shells, and claw marks across the trees. This is the story of the grizzly bear that killed 5 police officers in 7 minutes. It was a crisp September morning in 2016. The Alaskan wilderness of Wrangell-St. Elias National Park shrouded in pre-dawn mist. At 5:37 a.m., a tripwire alarm shattered the silence with 3 sharp metallic clinks. Within 7 minutes, 5 law enforcement officers would be dead, victims of one of nature's most perfect killing machines. The Special Response Unit had hiked 16 miles into the backcountry, tracking illegal poaching activity. They were following whoever had killed and partially buried a Kodiak bear, leaving bait piles to attract more victims. Fresh boot prints and spent rifle casings told them they were close. But there was something else in those tracks. The massive paw prints of a grizzly sow, broad and deep, still active in the area. The team represented diverse backgrounds. Sergeant Robert Kirsch, 45, was the most experienced, methodical, and measured. TJ Rell, 36, was a former smoke jumper with an aggressive approach to danger. Dennis Ngo, 32, came from animal control and followed protocols religiously. Janai Myers, 29, had a biology background, but this was her first deep backcountry deployment. Cal Hollis, 40, was disciplined and devout, on only his 2nd field assignment. With them was a civilian observer, Eric Layton, 39, a Park Service fire planner tasked with mapping seasonal burn zones. Layton wasn't armed and had no enforcement role. He was tagging along to coordinate future drone surveys over known poaching routes. He slept slightly away from the others, inside a blue tarp shelter strung between 2 trees. By his own later admission, he never heard the safety briefings. He was just there to observe and document. They established camp 200 yards from the bait site and set tripwire alarms. Only 1 heavy rifle had made it in with the initial gear drop. The rest of the team carried service sidearms and flares. A 2nd shipment of long guns was delayed due to air transport restrictions and poor weather. Standard complications in remote operations. It wasn't ideal, but the team had pushed forward, believing the bear that left the tracks had already moved on. That decision would prove catastrophically wrong. At 5:37 a.m., an alarm clinked from the northwest perimeter. Hollis, closest to the edge, moved to investigate. From his shelter, Layton heard him call softly, then a high, sharp scream that cut off mid-breath. Rell charged toward the sound without waiting. Layton, now fully alert, unzipped the front flap of his tent and watched through the mesh. He saw Rell vanish between the trees, then out of nowhere, it came. Grizzly bears' massive paws are equipped with claws up to 4 inches long, capable of disemboweling prey with a single swipe. Their bite force of over 1,200 pounds per square inch is enough to crush a bowling ball. When wounded or protecting a food source, these apex predators become exponentially more dangerous. The bear's forepaw struck Rell with devastating force, launching him sideways into a fir trunk with an audible crack. As his body crumpled, the grizzly clamped its jaws around his shoulder and began dragging him toward the underbrush. Ngo fired a flare, briefly illuminating the carnage in hellish red light. Myers screamed. Kirsch shouldered the .375 rifle and fired twice, both rounds missing as the bear twisted behind cover. Using terrain instinctively, the bear circled behind them. Grizzlies are known for using cover surprisingly well, even in thick brush. Myers had barely begun her radio transmission when the bear struck her from behind. Kirsch spun, raised the rifle again, and this time found his mark, a neck shot that sprayed blood against the trees. Layton watched as it stood and turned, but the wounded bear didn't fall. Instead, it became even more dangerous, pain and rage driving it to new levels of aggression. Chungo, attempting to reach higher ground, turned to flee. The grizzly lunged with predatory precision, catching him by the legs and dragging him down. The mauling was brutal and efficient, deep, crushing blows that shattered ribs through his protective vest. His scream was cut short when the bear's jaws closed around his lower jaw, silencing him forever. Kirsch, now alone and facing a wounded apex predator, backed toward their equipment ATV. He kept the rifle raised, but the rifle's bolt was bent, likely from impact during the chaos, rendering it useless. The bear was gone again, but Leighton knew it wasn't over. He ducked low but didn't look away. Kirsch never saw it. The bear struck him from behind, slammed him against the ATV rack, and opened his throat in one clean motion. Then it stood over the body and sniffed the air. Leighton froze. His tent flap still hung open. He said the bear turned toward him once, ears high. It sniffed, then limped back toward the bait site, trailing blood. From the first alarm to the final death, the entire massacre lasted under 7 minutes. Under his tarp, 20 feet from the nearest tent, Eric Leighton had gone silent. He later told investigators he heard everything. The screams, the snaps of breaking branches, the radio static. When the flare lit up the trees, he saw the bear's silhouette once. Then he buried his head and stayed frozen under a pile of gear. Experts later said the bear likely ignored Leighton because he neither moved nor posed a threat, and its aggression had been tied to active stimuli: motion, sound, and proximity to the bait. 2 civilian rangers arrived at 8:12 a.m. by ATV for scheduled pickup. They found shredded tents, a mangled radio still transmitting static, blood trails, drag marks. The .375 rifle was jammed, its bolt bent and useless. Claw marks scarred the tree trunks chest high. Under the tarp, they found Leighton, pale, shaking, still clutching his field notebook. They followed a blood trail east toward the bait site. There, lying partially collapsed among a churned mess of moss and dirt, was the bear. The neck wound had finally bled out. The bear had died less than an hour after the final shot. Experts later said that it was likely food-conditioned and was defending a high-value bait site, reacting with territorial aggression heightened by injury and prolonged human scent intrusion. No official photos were released. The public report cited only a fatal wildlife engagement under review. Leighton was not interviewed by the media and later transferred to administrative duty in Anchorage. Funerals were held quietly. Myers's family refused all press. Hollis was buried in Palmer. Rel's ashes were scattered in Denali. Ngau's parents requested no service. Kirsch received no posthumous commendation. The bait site was never tied to any suspect. Casings were untraceable, and trail cams were wiped. This group had rifles and training, but it still wasn't enough. Meanwhile, just 1 state over, a man with only a whistle walked straight into the path of another grizzly and never came back. It was August 17, 2015. The Montana wilderness lay still under the dry weight of late summer, heat radiating off the slopes of Gallatin National Forest. Somewhere north of Thompson Ridge, James Jimmy Crawl walked alone into the trees with a camera slung across his chest and a sandwich wrapped in foil. By evening, what search crews would find of him had to be lifted out in 2 separate bags. Jimmy was a 34-year-old seasonal trail crew worker in his 4th summer with the Forest Service. Originally from Missoula, he spent winters fixing chainsaws and outboard motors at a small repair garage. He was quiet, carried a compass instead of GPS, and preferred solitude to camp chatter. On rest days, he often disappeared alone with his camera and a single bottle of water, returning with photos of elk and moose he never bothered naming aloud. Years earlier, Jimmy had discovered a hidden spring while scouting game trails. It wasn't on any map, just a trickle of cold water between rocks near a narrow ridge cut. He claimed the elk liked it there, returning often to photograph wildlife in the secluded spot. That morning, while others played cards at base camp, he packed a sandwich, filled his canteen, and strapped his camera to his chest. Forest Service alerts had warned of increased bear activity due to an unusually dry season, pushing wildlife closer to human trails in search of food. Earlier that week, a black bear had been spotted near camp dumpsters. Jimmy had dismissed it as not the dangerous kind. He carried a bear whistle on a lanyard, but refused bear spray, claiming bears smell it coming anyway. His belief that silence was more respectful in wild places would prove fatal. Grizzlies in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem can weigh 1,000 pounds, sprint at 35 miles per hour, and smell carrion from miles away. Their 4-inch claws can tear through bone, and surprise encounters near food caches often trigger violent, instinctive attacks. By early afternoon, Jimmy moved beyond maintained paths into steep terrain, stepping over windfall and pushing through saplings. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, and the air smelled of ripened chokecherries and damp earth. As he neared the ridge, he paused to photograph elk antlers lodged in brush. He passed torn-up logs and fresh claw marks on a lodgepole pine, warning signs he either didn't notice or chose to ignore. Roughly 300 yards away, hikers Aaron and Mark DeWitt of Spokane had stopped to rest along a narrow trail with a clear overlook of the slope Jimmy was crossing. They spotted movement through the trees. First Jimmy's red flannel shirt, then something low and brown following through the brush. Mark raised his binoculars. The attack happened fast. The grizzly emerged behind a downed log and charged without sound. Jimmy had just raised his camera when the bear collided with him, knocking him flat. Aaron screamed. Mark shouted and began sprinting down the slope. From their position, they saw the grizzly rake Jimmy's torso with its claws, then clamp its jaws onto his shoulder and shake violently. Jimmy thrashed for seconds before going limp. Like many fatal maulings, the bear seemed to target Jimmy's head, ripping upward from the jawline in what experts call a predatory finishing behavior. By the time Mark reached him, the bear had dragged Jimmy partway into the brush, swatting at his backpack and huffing. Mark screamed, waving his arms. The bear rose up, taller than any human, and stared for 3 long seconds before dropping to all fours and thundering into the forest. Aaron arrived moments later, shaking, radioing for help. Jimmy was still alive. His chest had been opened down to the ribcage. His jaw hung broken, teeth shattered. He couldn't speak, but his eyes were wide and locked onto Mark's. Mark, a former combat medic, packed gauze into the wounds and tried to slow the bleeding, but Jimmy's breathing grew shallow. He died less than 10 minutes later. Their emergency radio pinged a ranger station 12 miles south, where fire crews happened to be staging. A medevac team was airborne within 90 minutes. Rangers reported a strong smell of decaying meat in the area and believed the bear had been guarding a cached elk carcass hidden nearby. No cache was located, but signs of bear traffic were heavy. The area was closed indefinitely. Jimmy's funeral was held quietly in Missoula 5 days later, attended by family, co-workers, and a few Forest Service officials. No speeches were made, and his closed casket was draped with a wool blanket instead of a flag, as he had requested years earlier. Yet even as the Montana wilderness claimed another person who ventured too far from marked paths, thousands of miles away, a high school teacher, walking a trail she'd known for years, would learn too late that not all bears bluff, especially not when food is scarce. It was May 2nd, 2013, the late-day sunlight filtering through the hardwood canopy of the Great Smoky Mountains, as Claire Densmore adjusted her camera settings one final time. The 42-year-old art teacher from Maryville had no way of knowing that in less than 5 minutes, she would become another statistic in nature's unforgiving, deadly surprises. Claire was an experienced hiker who had walked these trails for over 2 decades. Her colleagues often joked that she could identify every wildflower in the Smokies and navigate the backcountry with her eyes closed. Her scratched DSLR camera had captured thousands of images across these mountains, each one a testament to her deep connection with the natural world. This spring weekend trip with her girlfriend Sandy Lou and 15-year-old son Jonah was meant to be a peaceful reset, a chance to photograph early wildflowers and share her love of the outdoors with the people she cared about most. That afternoon, Claire and Sandy had left Jonah at their backcountry campsite to rest his sore ankle while they explored a narrow ridge trail. Claire moved ahead, drawn by a cluster of blooming trillium that would make perfect subjects for her photography. However, trail advisories had been posted that spring after a black bear had bluff-charged a solo hiker near Gregory Ridge. Though smaller than grizzlies, black bears in the Smokies can weigh up to 500 pounds and break a human's neck with one swipe. Their curved claws inflict deep wounds, and when startled or defending territory, they can attack with sudden, lethal force. Rangers had also mentioned recent bear bedding signs found in dense mountain laurel on the southern slope near Abrams Creek. But Claire, confident in her experience and familiarity with these trails, had dismissed the warnings with characteristic optimism. She carried no bear spray, relying instead on a whistle and her knowledge of bear behavior to keep her safe. At approximately 5:03 p.m., Sandy heard a sharp crash from down the ridge, followed by Claire's voice, something shouted but garbled by distance and terrain. Then came a sound that made her blood run cold. Sandy ran toward the sound, expecting to find Claire injured from a fall. Instead, at the edge of the ravine, she witnessed a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Claire was down the slope, partially obscured by underbrush, with a large black bear standing over her. The animal had emerged from a stand of mountain laurel, where it had likely been resting, and struck Claire broadside with devastating force. She had landed hard against a downed log, one arm raised defensively as the bear's claws tore through her jacket and into the flesh of her shoulder. The bear's massive jaws clamped down on her upper left arm, shaking its head violently. Sandy screamed and threw her water bottle, then grabbed a thick branch and hurled it down the slope. The bear paused momentarily, raising its head and standing upright to assess this new threat. Its broad shoulders and spring-thickened fur made it appear even more massive and intimidating. But instead of retreating, the bear dropped back down and seized Claire by the torso, dragging her sideways into deeper cover where the dense ferns and underbrush swallowed them both. Claire's screams echoed through the forest before being abruptly silenced. Sandy scrambled partway down the slope, but couldn't penetrate the dense brush. Her hands trembling, she activated the GPS distress beacon clipped to her belt, the small device that would summon help that would arrive too late. By 6:47 p.m., 2 backcountry rangers arrived with rifles and first aid equipment. They found Claire's body 30 yards downhill, partially concealed by vegetation. Her torso and neck had sustained massive trauma, deep puncture wounds, and lacerations that told the story of a brief but devastating encounter with one of nature's most efficient killers. The investigation revealed no obvious trigger for the attack. No food, no scented items, no evidence of cubs in the area. Rangers concluded that Claire had likely startled the bear from its resting place in the mountain laurel thicket, triggering a defensive response that escalated into a fatal mauling. It was a reminder that even experienced outdoors enthusiasts can fall victim to the unpredictable nature of wild animals. Claire's funeral was held 4 days later in Maryville, with Sandy, students, fellow teachers, and family filling the small community center auditorium. Her closed casket sat beneath a projection of her final photographs: wildflowers, trail bridges, and mist-covered ridgelines. Park officials closed the surrounding trails for 2 weeks and installed additional signage warning of recent bear activity. The bear was not located, and wildlife authorities decided against a search or kill order, determining the attack to be a rare but natural defensive incident. Tennessee mountains proved that familiar trails can turn deadly without warning. Similarly, in the Arctic, a young researcher would learn that the world's largest land predator shows no mercy to those who venture into its territory. It was July 10, 2018. The Arctic sun hung low over the ice near Resolute Bay as Gary Holtz, a 28-year-old graduate research assistant from Ottawa, set out to deploy one last camera. He was focused on completing his fieldwork before weather conditions worsened. He didn't know he was walking into the territory of the Arctic's most efficient land predator. Gary was a promising young researcher working on his master's thesis in Arctic ecology, focusing on fox migration patterns across the unforgiving landscape of permafrost and sea ice. His colleagues described him as brilliant in the lab, but inexperienced in the field, a dangerous combination in one of Earth's most hostile environments. This was his first season north of the tree line, and his enthusiasm to prove himself would ultimately override the caution that keeps researchers alive in polar bear country. What Gary likely didn't fully comprehend was the lethal efficiency of the predator that called this frozen wilderness home. Polar bears are the largest land carnivores, with males weighing up to 1,500 pounds and standing over 10 feet tall. They can sprint at 25 miles per hour, detect prey from over a mile away, and kill with a single swipe of their 4-inch claws. And most terrifyingly, unlike other bear species, polar bears actively hunt humans, viewing them as potential prey rather than threats to be avoided. That morning, Gary had been working with a wildlife logistics team near the edge of shifting sea ice, deploying GPS tracking equipment and remote cameras to monitor Arctic fox populations. A local Inuit guide, experienced in polar bear safety and armed with flares and a rifle, had been assigned to accompany him during all field operations. Recent bear activity in the area, fresh scat, tracks, and multiple sightings had prompted strict safety protocols. The rule was absolute: never separate from the guide, regardless of circumstances. The warning signs were there from the beginning. The guide had expressed concern about increasing winds from the west, conditions that could fracture and drift the ice floes unpredictably. When Gary insisted they had enough time to reach the final burrow cluster, the guide agreed reluctantly, emphasizing they needed to move quickly and stay together. But Gary's academic ambition and desire to complete his research objectives would prove stronger than his survival instincts. Around 12:45 p.m., they made the deadly decision to split up. Gary moved east on foot with the final camera unit while the guide checked an older marker nearby. Despite his usual caution, the guide hesitated, but gave in. Visibility was good, and they'd been out for hours with no new tracks. It felt like a calculated risk. At 1:04 p.m., the guide heard the sharp crack of a gunshot echoing across the ice, followed by desperate shouts. He turned to see Gary running frantically across the treacherous surface, rifle in one hand, pack slung open and spilling equipment. Behind him, moving with terrifying purpose, was a massive male polar bear, likely over 900 pounds. Gary's inexperience with Arctic conditions became immediately apparent as his boots slipped on the melting ice crust. He staggered at the edge of a narrow lead, a dangerous split in the ice, and lost his footing completely. The rifle clattered away across the frozen surface as he hit the slush, leaving him defenseless against one of nature's most efficient killers. The bear reached him within seconds, moving with the silent efficiency that has made polar bears the undisputed rulers of the Arctic. It clamped its massive jaws around Gary's shoulder, the crushing force of its bite instantly breaking bones and tearing through muscle and tissue. The bear then dragged Gary's body 30 feet toward an outcrop of piled ice and snow, a behavior consistent with polar bears securing their prey before consumption. The guide fired a flare, the bright burst of light causing the bear to flinch momentarily, but not release its grip on Gary's motionless form. A second flare was launched as the guide shouted and advanced slowly, following protocols designed to drive off aggressive bears. The massive predator paused, assessed this new threat, then retreated behind a wind-carved ridge, disappearing into the Arctic landscape as suddenly as it had appeared. The guide immediately called for a rescue team, which arrived within an hour, but it was far too late. Rangers found the attack site streaked with blood and drag marks, bits of clothing and equipment embedded in the slush. Gary's body lay partially concealed behind the ice ridge, his parka torn open to reveal the devastating injuries inflicted by the bear's claws and teeth. The investigation revealed that Gary had fired only one shot, likely in panic as the bear closed the distance between them. There was no evidence of food conditioning or provocation. The bear had simply acted on its predatory instincts, viewing the isolated human as an opportunity for an easy meal. The research operation was immediately shut down, equipment hastily packed and airlifted out with military assistance. Gary's remains were flown to Ottawa under quiet escort, his death handled with the bureaucratic discretion that often surrounds such tragedies in remote locations. Parks Canada reviewed the incident and revised their polar bear safety protocols, adding an absolute prohibition against researchers separating from their assigned guides under any circumstances. The Arctic ice claimed another researcher who ignored his guide's warnings about separation. And halfway around the world, in the peaks of the Himalayas, a solitary photographer would discover that abandoned monastery ruins offer no sanctuary when an Asiatic black bear corners its prey on a crumbling cliff ledge. It was October 1st, 2014. In the damp hills of western Sikkim, freelance photographer Ravi Malhotra set out before sunrise, hoping to capture the morning light from a ridge above camp. The 44-year-old freelance photographer from Kolkata had no way of knowing that his quest to capture the perfect sunrise would lead him into a deadly encounter with one of the Himalayas' most formidable predators. Ravi was a solitary artist who had spent 2 decades documenting India's vanishing landscapes, crumbling temples, forgotten footpaths, and lost village rituals that existed only in the memories of elders. His colleagues knew him as reclusive, a man who preferred the company of shadows and stone to human conversation. He traveled light, carried a beaten camera loaded with film, and rarely bothered with the safety protocols that kept other photographers alive in remote locations. That late September, Ravi had embarked on a solo journey to photograph remote Buddhist shrine ruins near Tashiding, drawn by stories of a partially collapsed monastery he'd heard about from a tea cellar the previous spring. Local villagers had warned him about increased bear activity in the area, animals coming down from higher elevations to strip walnut trees and scavenge near abandoned structures. But Ravi, like so many before him, dismissed these warnings as local superstition rather than the life-saving advice they were meant to be. He had pitched his small tent inside the roofless stone ruin 2 days before the attack, hoping to capture the perfect sunrise over the Rangit Valley. The location he chose sat below a narrow ledge that curved around a steep, brush-covered slope, where rhododendron, bamboo, and Himalayan oak grew thick enough to conceal potential predators. On the morning of October 1st, Ravi likely ventured out early to scout camera angles for the dawn light, moving along the treacherous ledge trail above his camp. What he didn't know, or chose to ignore, was that Asiatic black bears often bed down in exactly these types of dense thickets during early morning hours, particularly during the pre-winter feeding season when they become territorial and aggressive toward any perceived threats. Adult males can weigh up to 400 pounds, with 3-inch claws that can tear flesh in a single swipe. At 5:18 a.m., a trekking group from Gangtok heard the frantic barking of their pack dogs echoing up the ridge, followed by a man's voice, panicked and desperate, before being abruptly cut off. 2 local porters, walking ahead of the main group, moved cautiously toward the sound of distress. From a quarter-mile distance, they witnessed a haunting scene. Ravi was clinging desperately to the lower edge of a rock face, an instinctive but futile move. Asiatic black bears, with claws made for climbing, followed with ease. The bear struck downward, its razor-sharp claws slashing at Ravi's legs until he lost his grip and plummeted onto the rocky trail below. He tried desperately to crawl toward a rock shelf that might provide shelter, but the bear dropped after him. Unlike the quick kills favored by some predators, the bear mauled Ravi for nearly 2 minutes, its claws tearing through flesh and muscle while its powerful jaws crushed bone. The porters, still too far away and completely unarmed, could only watch in horror as the bear systematically destroyed its human prey. When the bear finally vanished uphill into the rhododendron scrub, it left behind a scene of carnage. Ravi lay unconscious on the trail, bleeding from massive head and neck wounds, with deep lacerations covering his arms and legs. The porters reached him within minutes, but the damage was already catastrophic. With no cell service and terrain too difficult for rapid evacuation, it took over 3 hours to reach a trailhead where a vehicle could meet them. The rural clinic nurse who examined Ravi's broken body declared his injuries incompatible with transport survival, a clinical way of saying that the bear had inflicted wounds no human could survive. Per his family's wishes, Ravi's body was cremated in Sikkim, close to where he had died pursuing his art. His ashes were flown back to Kolkata, where a small circle of friends and colleagues mourned the loss of a talented photographer whose final expedition had ended in tragedy. The trekking company whose porters witnessed the attack added laminated handouts warning guests about bear activity and the dangers of leaving marked trails at dawn. Thanks for watching. If today's tragedies piqued your interest, the next video features more deadly animals. See you there.